Okay, it's noon. I call to order the Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee meeting for September 29th, 2020. Ms. Clerk, may we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Here.
Chair Gutierrez.
Here. Okay, let the minutes reflect that we're all present. Ms. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, not.
Okay, now if there's any public comment for items that are not on the agenda. Ms. Clerk, are there any speakers?
Do not have public comment on for items off the agenda.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Clerk, would you please read our agenda item, please?
Yes. Subject, zoning ordinance amendments for accessory dwelling units. Recommendation that ordinance committee review and consider recommending that city council adopt amendments to the inland zoning ordinance, Santa Barbara Municipal Code Title 30, and coastal zoning ordinance, Santa Barbara Municipal Code Title 28 for accessory dwelling units.
Thank you, Ms. Clerk. May we have a staff report, please?
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. I'm Rosie Deisty, project planner with the Community Development Department. Next slide. And the purpose of the hearing today is to review proposed amendments to the inland and coastal zoning ordinances for accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units, and ask for your recommendation to City Council for adoption. Next slide, please. My presentation today will talk a little bit about the background of our own legislation and state legislation. And the new state legislation. I'll give a high-level summary of the ordinance amendments. We have a few topics. There are policy decisions for further discussion, and I'll talk about next steps. Next slide. So accessory dwelling units are also known as granny flats, in-law units, and secondary units. And what they are is obviously a self-contained additional housing unit with a kitchen, bathroom, and a place to sleep. They range in size from as small as 150 square feet for a studio and can go up to 1,200 square feet for a unit with multiple bedrooms. And both the city and the state see them as an innovative, affordable, effective option for adding much needed housing in California. Next slide. And then a junior accessory dwelling unit is always within the walls of an existing or proposed single residential unit. By state law, they're limited to 500 square feet maximum. They have an efficiency kitchen. They can have their own or a shared bathroom, and they need to have an exterior entrance. Next slide. So there's a couple different common types of construction for accessory dwelling units. New construction includes detached freestanding structures. A unit can be attached and share the wall with a primary unit, or it can be above and on top of an existing or reconstructed garage. There's also converted space, which can be either interior converted space or a converted garage or accessory building that's either attached or detached from the main unit. Next slide. So I'm gonna go over a couple of key dates since 2017, when the state first passed a new legislation to facilitate the development of accessory dwelling units. And then after multiple hearings, the city adopted their own Title 30 inland zoning ordinance amendments for accessory dwelling units were effective in June 2018. Then just last fall, Governor Newsom signed new legislation to further facilitate the development of accessory dwelling units. And not too long thereafter, the city adopted an interim urgency ordinance for accessory dwelling units, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But before we get there, the new state laws became effective in January 2020, and then the interim urgency ordinance was extended until December of this year. Next slide. So the interim urgency ordinance, again, is valid until December 17, 2020, and what it did is provided time for staff to understand and interpret the new state laws, which were quite complex. It also provided time to consider some wildfire planning studies that were just getting started at the same time and coordinate our ordinance amendments with the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And what it did was enact a couple of temporary prohibitions of accessory dwelling units in the foothill and extreme foothill high fire hazard areas and on properties with or next to a historic resource, but only if there would be a substantial adverse change to that resource. Next slide. And so this provides a snapshot of where we're at with the applications we've received since 2017. And as you can see, the vast majority are for converting existing structures. That's followed by new detached accessory dwelling units and then additions as attached accessory dwelling units. Next slide. And then this map shows where they are being built, which clearly shows they're pretty much in the suburban areas of the city and pretty much everywhere throughout the city. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give a fairly high level review of the proposed amendments. Next slide. So the scope of what we are proposing before you today are both amendments to the inland and coastal versions of the zoning ordinance. And the draft ordinance amendments are a mix of what we had formerly adopted in 2018 with some minor amendments based on staff's experience with permitting ADUs and to facilitate certain accessory dwelling unit types and such. And then we have a whole host of new standards in order to comply with the state law that was passed late last year. Next slide. So I wanted to touch a little bit deeper on the difference between the Title 30 and the Title 28 amendments. And Title 28 Coastal Zoning Ordinance was not amended in 2018 as staff was in the process of a major coastal land use plan amendment at the time and was not able to take on another LCP amendment. So this time, since we have adopted the coastal land use plan, we would like to propose similar standards for both the coastal and inland areas for accessory dwelling units. And we've spoken to local California Coastal Commission staff who's supportive of a standalone zoning ordinance amendments for accessory dwelling units. But some of the differences are that this amendment would require certification by the Coastal Commission before it's effective. So that would occur at some point next year. Also, there's a different permit process for projects in the coastal zone. So those projects require either a coastal exemption, a coastal exclusion, or a coastal development permit, depending on the project type. And then there's a couple of differences between Title 30 and Title 28, just to ensure we're consistent with our certified coastal land use plan. For example, development does need to be avoided in some environmentally sensitive and hazardous areas per the coastal plan. The non-conforming building policies are a little stricter in the coastal zone and need to be complied with. And then projects in certain parking impacted areas do need to be evaluated to ensure there's no impact to public parking for access to the beach and the coast. So those are the main differences between the two sets of ordinance amendments. Next slide. So the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about some of the key state law amendments. There were quite a few amendments, but these touch on probably the most significant ones. So the biggest change is the first bullet. These are what's termed as mandated statewide exemption ADUs, which certain ADUs are exempt from certain local development standards. And because this is such a big change, we'll be talking about that in more detail in the next few slides. State law also expanded where junior ADUs are allowed. So it used to be in the bedroom of an existing or proposed single residential unit. Now they can be in any room of those units and also potentially in an attached garage. State law shortened the permit processing time, which used to be 120 days, and now it's 60 days from when an application has been deemed complete. and it changed some of the parking regulations. So if somebody converts their garage to an accessory dwelling unit, the city is unable to require that that parking be replaced on site. Next slide. State law also reduced some of the required interior setbacks to a maximum of 4 feet. And they also put in place a temporary prohibition on owner occupancy requirements for 5 years. So that sunsets January 1st, 2025, except for junior accessory dwelling units, which are always required to have an owner occupant per state law. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about those mandated statewide ADUs, which we are calling in our ordinance special ADUs. And what this did is expanded the number of ADUs that can be allowed on per lot. So there's an option to get both an ADU and a junior ADU, or more than one ADU per lot. But they are limited in the types of ADUs, so they can only be a conversion or a detached ADU. There are some size and height limits on these, and they are exempt from some of the city's lot coverage and similar floor area limitations. Next slide. And then standard ADUs are essentially what we've been permitting since 2017. So it does allow some of these development standards to apply, where we only allow one ADU or junior ADU per lot, but all the configuration types are allowed, including on top of, attached to and on top of a garage, like shown in this photo. There is greater size and height flexibility, and but they are subject to some of our lot coverage and floor area limitations. Next slide. So this slide, I'm going to dive just a little bit deeper into the differences. And what this shows in the chart is the number of ADUs allowed per lot and what's already existing on the site. So as you can see, special ADUs allow 2 or potentially even more accessory dwelling units. Again, the types or the configurations of ADUs can be all types for the standards, and they're limited to conversions or detached for the special ADUs. Just highlighting, if you have an existing multi-unit development on the lot, you are allowed either 2 detached ADUs, or you can convert up to 25% of the existing units. You can convert non-livable space to ADUs. And then on this last point, where they're allowed, I'll be talking about this in more detail later in the presentation, but essentially special ADUs would be allowed anywhere in the city, and staff is recommending or proposing that standard ADUs be allowed everywhere except the extreme foothill and foothill high fire hazard areas. Next slide. And then this slide shows the configuration and size differences between the 2 types of ADUs. So if a existing accessory structure is converted to an ADU, there's no size or height limit. You're just converting what's already there. For detached units, you can get a larger unit size with standard ADUs. So it's on a sliding scale depending on lot size, but it goes from 850 square foot maximum to 1,200 square feet. Whereas per state law, a special ADU is 800 square foot maximum. Attached units can be 50% of the size of the existing unit. And again, that's not one of the configurations that's covered under the special ADU provisions. And then for height limits, per state law, special ADUs are limited to 16 feet. But if you want a standard ADU, you can, you have way more height flexibility. It's either the existing unit height or 17 feet. We have an exemption for above a garage, and then there's a process to get an even taller ADU up to 30 feet. Next slide, please. So in 2018, after much discussion, the city adopted certain standards for ADUs during the approval process, and this is some standards that staff is recommending to continue because they've worked really well. So as I mentioned in the last slide, standard detached ADUs do have a maximum unit size by lot size on a sliding scale. Also for standard ADUs, we provided some flexibility in the size of the open yard, or the required open yard for the primary unit, and the location of that open yard so people had room to put in an ADU. We have a list of architectural review criteria that's strictly an objective checklist that was worked out in the prior ordinance and has worked really well. And on a similar note, there's also a provision to protect sites that have an existing structure of merit or a landmark structure, whereas the architectural historian can review visible ADUs and just make sure they don't detract from that historic structure. For parking, we reduce parking requirements, but we also, if somebody wants to provide parking on the site, we provided flexibility on where it could be located. And then lastly, we developed some pretty important fire safety standards for ADUs that are proposed in high fire hazard areas that we'd like to continue. Next slide. So prior to the first hearing on the draft ordinance amendments in August, staff sent an administrative draft of the ordinance to the California Coastal Commission staff and Housing and Community Development for early review. And we also got a set of comments from the American Institute of Architects. And what this resulted in was a number of clarifying amendments that have been already incorporated into the draft for your packet. And this early review we think is really helpful because it means that future review that's required by the California Coastal Commission and Housing and Community Development should hopefully be expedited and will receive few, if any, further amendments from those two agencies. Next slide, please. So the Planning Commission held 2 hearings on the draft ordinance amendments in August and September. And a number of topics came up at the first hearing, both from Planning Commission members and the public, that were a little beyond strict compliance with state law, and it involves some policy decisions for your committee and full council. So we'll be talking about those in a moment. But ultimately, the Planning Commission recommended that council adopt the proposed amendments, and then they took a straw poll vote on the discussion items that I'll be talking about next. Next slide, please. And sorry, next slide after this one. Okay, so starting with owner occupancy, this has been a much discussed topic starting in 2018, and there's been renewed interest in this topic this time around as well. So prior to the changes in state law, the city required owner occupancy for accessory dwelling units that are in the residential single unit zone. And the idea behind that requirement was to protect neighborhood stability and potentially reduce speculation and absentee ownership. So with the state's 5-year suspension of the ability to require owner occupancy per state law, there has popped up some equity concerns, both for those who have already recorded a covenant that requires owner occupancy, and for those projects that perhaps are proposed 5 years from now and would have that owner occupancy requirement back on the books. So we had 2 questions on this topic. The first one is, should staff develop a process that existing recording covenants could remove the owner occupancy requirement on the property owner's request? And the Planning Commission did take a straw poll vote on this one, and majority passed, they agreed. And then the second question was, should we just go ahead and amend the ordinance and permanently remove the owner occupancy requirement? And that one did fail to pass the straw poll vote, given that some commissioners thought we should wait and see how it works out in the 5-year sunset period, evaluate the impact perhaps on the neighborhoods before removing it permanently. Next slide. So accessory dwelling units in high fire hazard areas has also always been a policy decision of the city. And the former ordinance did ban them in the extreme foothill high fire hazard zone, except for junior accessory dwelling units, and then required additional fire safety standards for accessory dwelling units in the foothill zones. And this was a strategic approach taken at the time to sort of balance out general plan policy, which called for pretty much no development of ADUs in high fire hazard areas, and the desire to increase housing in the city and allow these units. So this time around, the city does still have discretion over where standard ADUs can be located based on public health and safety concerns. And staff has taken the approach to sort of continue similarly to our former ordinance and basically allow the special ADUs and junior accessory dwelling units everywhere in the city, but to consider prohibiting standard ADUs in the extreme foothill and foothill high fire hazard areas. So this was discussed by the Planning Commission, and they did take a majority vote to allow standard accessory dwelling units also in these areas, meaning there would be no location limitations of accessory dwelling units anywhere in the city based on fire hazards. Next slide. Okay, another topic that came up was the posted sign requirement. And this was originally adopted in 2018. And the idea behind it is that it would alert the neighbors that a project is being proposed and maybe provide an opportunity for neighbors to talk to each other about any concerns they may have or questions about the proposed development. The downside to requiring this sign is that it can perhaps give a false impression that there's a public hearing for accessory dwelling units because it's a ministerial process and there is no public hearing. And also it may give the impression that neighbors can view project plans easily online, which is not the case. They need to do a Public Records Act request to view plans. So the Planning Commission did pass a majority vote to delete the sign requirement, but we would like to offer other options if your committee or full council likes the sign requirement. We could keep it, but change the wording to make it really clear what it means. Or another option is to provide a mailed or hand-delivered notice instead. So there's a couple ways we could go with this one. Next slide. And then the final topic for a policy discussion is directed to accessory dwelling unit conversions in multi-unit residential buildings, which could include all residential or mixed use. So as I mentioned before, state law now allows conversions of up to 25% of the existing units. And the intent in state law was to convert storage rooms, carports, garages, boiler rooms, rooms like that. And so state law does not specifically discuss what to do with mixed use buildings or conversion of commercial space. It's silent on it. So at the request of the American Institute of Architects, they wanted us to consider allowing non-residential portion of mixed use buildings to convert to accessory dwelling units. And we did discuss this concept with the Planning Commission, but staff and the Planning Commission agreed that we should study this a little further to consider it in a bigger context with other housing work that's currently underway, and to provide some time to consider what sort of standards we would want for such conversions. For example, technically someone could convert a large commercial space to just one really large ADU, and I don't think that would meet the intent of state law. So Planning Commission did agree that this should be considered at a future date with further study. So this is something we could look at with the housing element update or other programs going on with the city. Next slide. So now I'm just going to wrap it up with some next steps and a timeline. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we went to Planning Commission in August and September, and today we're before your committee for your recommendation. If all goes well today and you can make that recommendation to City Council, we plan to have the first reading at the end of October and then followed by the second reading in early November, which would make our inland Title 30 zoning ordinance amendments effective in by December 12th, or sorry, December 10th. And the inter-emergency ordinance expires on December 17th. So it'd be good to get that in before it expires. And then we would follow that with the local coastal program amendments submittal in early 2021. Next slide. And I just wanted to touch on that the California Environmental Quality Act does not apply to adoption of an ordinance implementing state accessory dwelling unit law. So we do not need to do a CEQA review. Next slide. And I will end on the recommendation to review the proposed amendments to Title 28 and Title 30 for accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units, and ask for your recommendation to City Council for adoption. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you for that presentation. Now I'd like to open it up to my colleagues for any questions they may have for staff. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to say thanks to staff, both Ms. Dicey and I'm sure Mr. Gullett, for slogging through this, where the rules change every couple months and then we reboot and then the rules change again. It's a pretty big undertaking. So I just have a couple quick questions, and that's one is that with the work you've done, we're now brought into alignment with all of the state legislation up till now. Is that correct?
Council Member Jordan, yes, that is correct. We, as I mentioned, we ran the draft ordinance through the State Housing and Community Development Department, who really has the final say. And aside from some clarifying amendments, they conclude that we're consistent with new state law.
Okay, and then in the discussion point of the high fire areas, that standard ADU, whether to allow them there, is not part of state legislation. That is clearly within our discretion to do or not do that. Is that how I read that?
Yeah, Council Member Jordan, as long as we permit the special ADUs, you know, the 800 square foot detached units and all the other ones that fall under that category, then state law allows us to have discretion on the other types of ADUs based on, you know, public health and safety and other considerations like that.
And so then,
Yeah.
Yep, Mark, no. And then, so could you walk me through in a high fire zone what special ADU choices would look like? I'm back to one of those charts, but I'm just having trouble even trying to figure it out what that really looks like on the ground. So a standard ADU would be your normal attached or detached ADU meeting our requirements and constraints on a normal ADU. And we have the ability, we have the discretionary approval of having them or not having them in the high fire zones. But when you are legislatively required to do the special ones, what would they potentially look like on the ground in the same place?
Okay, yeah, I can easily do that. So the high fire hazard areas, whatever they are called now or in the future, it would include anyone could do a junior accessory dwelling unit, so convert a room in their single unit house or attached garage. Anyone could do any kind of conversion accessory dwelling unit, actually. So that includes garages, barns, pool houses, whatever an accessory structure that's eligible to convert, they could do that.
Attached or detached, right?
Correct. And that converted unit is not limited by size or height or anything because it's already there.
Okay. And so before you go on, just a clarifying question on that. That detached or attached unit that's already there could resemble a standard ADU also if it was allowed to be there, because we do control the size and the height a little more than the special, right? It's kind of the nexus I'm trying to really what's concerning me is if we were to make a recommendation to prohibit standard ADUs in the high fire zones, but we still have to allow specials, is what will appear as specials still be the equivalent of standards under the special legislative constraints and guidelines, right? Or could it potentially?
Council Member Jordan, I actually not exactly sure what you're asking, but what might be easier would be for me to say what would, under our
Okay.
proposed version, what would not be allowed.
Okay.
Would that be easier?
Maybe. Yeah,
Okay.
where I'm kind of going is kind of this sense that, let's just pick a number and say a standard is a 800 to 1200 square foot detached ADU in the high fire zone.
Mhm.
And maybe we're not going to like that. But can you still find examples of specials that we would have no choice, and such a use would appear still in the high fire zones?
Okay, I think, yes. So what could be happening in the high fire hazard zones, and really we're, could be a 800 square foot detached 16-foot high unit.
Okay.
There's a special detached ADUs. Also, if, and the junior accessory dwelling units, those would be allowed. And any kind of conversion ADU would be allowed. What would not be allowed under the proposal would be a new construction attached unit to the primary residential unit.
That could be 50% of the floor space
Yes.
of what's there, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Or a detached ADU that's larger than 800 square feet.
Okay.
So
to
really
cut
what
to
we're,
my chase of concern is
Yeah.
the consideration between, we have to let specials be there, but we might want to consider not having standards be there, is the specials should generally be of smaller size and intensity than a standard could be. Would that be an accurate statement?
Councilmember Jordan, yes, that is an accurate statement. Where we do have some discretion is on the size of the unit, essentially. And given that a larger unit probably has more bedrooms, potentially more people and more
Right.
cars, it's one way to get at the concerns about the narrow winding roads and evacuation issues
Okay.
and that.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you,
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you. I have, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I have some similar questions follow up to Councilmember Jordan. So when I'm looking at, say, slide 18, and there are these comparisons, some of these, or maybe it's slide, the next one, slide 19. Some of these seem more expansive in what would be allowed in high fire, and some seem less expansive. Like in the standard, well, we can be bigger with the standard, and then the attached 50%. And then in the standard, it can be larger and discretionary height up to 30 feet. So is the reason that we can add the standard sort of overlay also is because it's more expansive, because you can build more, and that's why we can have that in some areas but not in others? I don't think I'm asking that well.
I think I know what you're asking, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, and that's part of it, but it's also a decision of the state that they wanted to ensure, it seems I'm sort of reading into their minds, but they wanted to ensure that almost anyone anywhere in the state could at least have, you know, an 800 square foot, 16-foot high detached accessory dwelling unit. And so they are allowing this despite what local jurisdictions may have concerns about, let's say lot coverage, open yard, in some instances setbacks. So a lot of things that might be stopping people from being able to have an accessory dwelling unit or minimum lot sizes, things like that. They've kind of made this decision that no, we want most people to be able to have this type of ADU. And so as long as we allow that, then the state's not that as concerned about the larger ADUs and where the city decides they can be located or not. They do limit it a little bit. They say you can limit them based on sewer, water, and traffic impacts,
But not fire. So sewer and
not
water.
specifically fire. Yeah.
Sewer, water, and for traffic impacts, I mean, we've just started doing, and you mentioned it in the PowerPoint and also in the staff report about taking time for the considerations of the fire evacuation. And would that be considered a traffic impact? Like, could we look at evacuation routes and traffic along those routes as a traffic impact?
So Mayor Pro Tem Snedden, they do specifically say water, sewer, or impacts on traffic flow and public safety. So that's where jurisdiction is allowed to designate areas. But after they say all that, there's a further provision in the state law that says, despite all those things, you still have to allow basically these special, what we're calling the special ADUs. So even if we did those traffic flow studies or evacuation route, evaluations, we still have to allow these 800 square foot detached ADUs, the conversion ADUs, and the potentially even multiple ADUs on sites with multi-unit housing. So,
and adding those numbers up for in a high fire zone, or just for a special, I guess, because that includes the high fire, because you're saying we have no option of saying that we're not allowing these in the high fire. The state has taken that option away. Is that
correct?
So adding up the possible number of units with a special, I'm not sure if I'm reading this right. You could have a junior ADU and 2 detached ADUs in addition?
Mayor Pro Tem Snedden, not quite. It's if you have an existing or you're proposing a new single unit housing, you can have the junior ADU and the detached ADU.
And that's for special. That's by the state. That's everywhere. So you have that figure or the slide that shows sort of where we're seeing these being built throughout the city. I think it's slide 10. And it doesn't show on here the sort of delineation of high fire and extreme high fire, but it's really the upper edges of that map. What numbers are we looking at? How many already are in the high fire specifically?
Oh, okay.
If you
specifically, yeah, we do.
Pipeline are already done.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem. So we have a total of 125, but that's including the city's 4 high fire hazard areas, which, as you know, there's foothill and extreme foothill in the northern reaches, but then we also have coastal and coastal interior. In foothill and extreme foothill, most of them are actually in the foothill area. That's 97. Extreme foothill, we only have 7. And then the coastal areas, 8 and 13. So the vast majority are in what's called the foothill high fire hazard zone.
And then for citywide, the potential, I mean, if we go with special, which we have no choice about, what is the additional potential of units that could be built under this mandate?
Mayor Pro Tem Snedden, so we did a evaluation of that back when the interim urgency ordinance was being looked at. And if you look at worst case scenario, like everyone develops to the maximum of what they could have, it looked like we could have, 51,000 units essentially. But that's, everyone. All of the, we have an existing almost 37,000 units, and it could go up to 51,000.
So the potential is there. And could that count towards our RENA numbers?
Oh, that's a great question, Mayor Pro Tem Snedden. And yes, they do. So when we do an annual report to Housing and Community Development on how we're doing with our permits. We do count accessory dwelling units in those numbers every year since our ordinance was passed.
So potentially, where we have our RENA requirements, and now we have no choice but to have special ADUs, what we're calling special ADUs, that could meet up to 51,000 of those units, approximately. I mean, I realize they're not all units. And would that take care of meeting our RENA number requirements?
Mayor Pro Tem Sten, not exactly because, oh, and Mr. Gullett's on who knows more about RENA, but I'll finish my sentence and let him chime in as well. So right now we've been counting those units as our above moderate units because we do not have any data showing what they're being rented at, and they typically are often nice new units that are rented at higher rents. We do plan, and we're actually required to in the future when we update the housing element, to work on ways to put accessory dwelling units in other categories for affordability. But right now we're counting them as above moderate, but I'll let Mr. Gullett speak more to RENA
Thank you.
this time.
Thank you, Ms. Deitze. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, we did anticipate a very low number of accessory dwelling units in the last housing element cycle. So we predicted something less than 200 net new units for all the single family zones. And we're seeing a lot more than that with accessory dwelling units. So we would be changing those assumptions moving forward. But we do need to look at realistic build out and not just theoretical maximum for RENA, but accessory dwelling units do help us get the zoning that we need, that the state's requiring of us.
So I guess this is, I mean, where I might be going with this when we go into discussion is we've been so far behind in housing, and then we've thrown all these things at it. Standard ADUs, which allow for larger and bigger and really almost essentially, it's not really a granny flat or a little add-on anymore. It's its own unit. And then AUDs and incentivizing all of those. And now the state has told us we have to allow these special ADUs everywhere, which is really concerning in the high fire and extreme high fire. The potential for the number of units that could go in those areas. And I guess my question is, I mean, when you're looking at bigger housing element questions, is if we're doing all of these things simultaneously, are we doing too much that we won't get credit for later, adding in new elements that incentivize housing later on? If we open everything up, and this one is through no choice of our own, but then we're also having the standard ADUs, and to my mind, the standard ADUs produce higher end units. They're larger, they're sort of fancier, they're they're not limited to this 800 square feet. They can be 2 stories. Some of them will have views that the main house doesn't even have. They tend to be counted, and I guess when you're counting the RENA numbers towards, you're saying that we're counting as above moderate because they rent for that much. So I'm wondering if just with the special ADU, which we have no jurisdiction over whether to accept or not, and if that's citywide, that may do more to produce affordable housing infill throughout the whole city than what we're trying to do with AUDs and what we're trying to do with standard ADUs and all these different. So I guess I want to put that out here now, that when there are questions of, say, consistency or keeping up with the state law, we could just go with just the special everywhere around the whole city and scrap the rest of it and have it be consistent. And then when state law changes, that's what it goes to, rather than always scrambling to keep up and sweeten the deal and make allowances and special things in certain parts of the city. It's just a thought and a question I have about the numbers. So I guess the question is how those would be counted towards our affordable units that we're not producing enough units of any kind, but I guess a more thorough look at what that does in what we can count. And potentially you could have more smaller ADUs than allowing one standard ADU, which really doesn't accommodate as many people for units. So I guess it's not really a question. Sorry, I should stay on questions, except for this, the number that are actually in the high fire and citywide. I mean, it looks like it's been successful. That looks like a lot to me. Is that the most of type of construction that we have is ADUs or?
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, because of this law change, we've seen this huge influx. Like with the map here, there's 541 units we've seen, which is significant. And with the average unit size density incentive program, those are in the realm of 800 units since inception of that. And I will say on RENA and the housing element, like these accessory dwelling units are part of our mix, and they're part of the solution. And we're trying to look at creative ways of having these be affordable. These aren't exactly in line with what our general plan says in terms of where we should be locating housing. More efficient housing is located in the grid in the downtown area where there are additional transportation options, where people are closer to work. But this is part of our housing environment right now. So we do want to see how we can leverage this best to get affordable housing and get more of these units built.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess just one more question. Is there any pushback to the state about these high fire allowances, having no discretion locally over where we're increasing density in high fire areas?
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, not specifically that I'm aware of. There was state legislation that got held up in committee just this year that would have prohibited new development, including accessory dwelling units in the very high fire hazard severity zones of the state. But that didn't move forward. So there's some consideration for that. There's so many discussions going on right now about housing and fire hazards. And as you know, there's fires burning right now, loss of housing and rebuilding. It's a huge statewide conversation that's ongoing, but I'm not aware of any specific pushback from other cities per se. I did hear one city was considering limiting or banning accessory dwelling units in high fire hazard areas, and the state told them if you wanted to do that, you could, but you'd have to ban also new development and additions and things like that. So it's not like we can't do it, but you'd have to ban everything. And I don't think we're ready to go there as a city.
Okay, so for simplicity, it might be that if we go with just special in the high fire and extreme high fire, then the state, as they're sort of adjusting and there will be maybe changes with fire recommendations or not, then we can just stay consistent with the minimum that the state is requiring us to allow.
Mayor, yes, correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. I just have one question, if you wouldn't mind going over the owner occupancy ordinance. From my understanding, that was put into place for one reason, is to try to deter corporations from buying big lots of land or properties to basically do what they will with them. Essentially, is that correct?
Councilmember Gutierrez, it's a piece of the puzzle. When it was originally adopted in 2018, it was more along the lines of potentially reducing speculation. And I think in our city, large corporations buying up lots and lots of homes is not really what occurs here. It is a nationwide issue that happens in certain areas with lots of foreclosures. But the thought at the time was more along the lines of neighborhood stability, and if an owner occupies the unit, potentially they take better care of it, those sorts of things. So the thought of the big corporation coming in and buying lots of homes it's not specific to the city of Santa Barbara. It's more of a issue that happens in some areas nationwide. And so it's really a policy choice of the city, should they want to keep this requirement or not.
Okay. So, so that's something that we necessarily shouldn't be too worried about. Okay. Well, that was my question as of right now. Now I believe we'll be ready for public comment. Ms. Clerk.
Chair Gutierrez, we have one individual who's raised their hand, and that's Alan Gallegos. Alan Gallegos, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, this is a pretty big call, and I'm surprised you don't have more people calling in. I think it could be an effect of COVID and using the phone and the WebEx, and people are being notified. It could be a challenge. But I'm glad you guys are having this discussion, and Mike and Kristen and Oscar, thank you for having this discussion and working through it. I believe that I agree with Kristen and some of Mike's concerns. I think that the state is allowing us to limit some stuff in high fire. I think we need to move forward with that. You know, we don't know where the state's going to go in the future, but if you looked at that chart and the number of homes, we have 7 in the high fire and in the extreme high fire, and you have more in the high fire. Well, these specials and these other cases will allow for people to expand. So I'm not sure why we'd want to add that type of risk in the environment we're in today. I mean, the news is littered with fires. And if you look at Ariba Way, which I've talked about a lot, you guys can free to roll your eyes. But the real big problem on Ariba Way is those 2 ADUs are going to add up to 8 people, 8 extra cars. And currently today, the existing tenant and owner park a ways away at the end of the other side of the street on Kenmore and Ariba Way because they don't have enough space. So there's already a big issue there. Also, if multiple people are parking on the other side of the street of Ariba Way, you can't get in or out. If there's a garbage truck or an electric vehicle or other service vehicles up there, no fire engine is going to get in or out. Emergency services are already hampered. Now, this is just one unique street, which is this bubble you guys have up on Ariba Way that's landlocked by county. It's awful, but we need to protect that street. And I'm sure there's other streets in the community that are also windy and small. So we need to think about that. Also, they're saying that if you take away a garage, you don't have to replace parking. Again, more stuff on the street in these high fire and extreme high fire areas. So we shouldn't mess around with this. Let's allow everything else and do what the state allows us to do. The other thing I wanted to mention was the notifications. You know, what's cheaper? If it is a sign that says something better, then do that. If it's sending out emails or cards, then do that. But letting people know is fair. And I think it should be something we think about. And then down to the owner occupancy, that's going to go away eventually. I'm almost out of time, just real quick. It's going to go away, but we should reward those who abide by it. If they've abided by it for since they've been required, then take it away, remove it. But if they've broken the law and they're not living there and they're not fulfilling that occupancy, then leave it in place until the state removes it.
Thank you,
Anyway,
Mr.
I'm sorry I took extra time, but thank you guys so much.
Appreciate it. Ms. Clerk, any more public comment?
Yes, we have 3 more individuals who have raised their hand. First will be Alex Pujo, then Sheila Lodge, Ken Dunkley, and 1 more, Susan Baker. Alex Pujo, please go ahead. Alex Pujo, please go ahead. And we'll come back to Mr. Pujo.
Oh, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure, I have spoken to you several times on behalf of accessory dwelling units, and I sent also letters, and so I would like to clarify one thing first, that the applications shown in the map that you've seen, those are applications, the 451 dots, those are applications submitted in 3.5 years. That doesn't mean that they are built. Some of them are probably rejected. So the percentage, the amount of units is not as high as it seems. It would probably be maybe 200 built in 3.5 years. It's not, the ratio is not that high. Also, they might be considered standard, but the average size, 70% of those applications are for conversions, mostly of garages. So we're talking about in the area of 400 to 600 square feet, as most of the units have been applied for. And I would like to make the point that I said in my letter about allowing spaces that are now used for commercial use within mixed-use complexes. There are not that many of them. It's not that they happen all over the place. It happens in areas close to town, in the areas where you would really like to see more units. And the Planning Commission was all in support of that, 7-0. But they were somehow swayed by the argument that we need to study this a little bit further and see what may happen or may not happen. Well, better do it now. Well, it's easy under this ordinance where you get things approved in 60 days and so forth. There are spaces that they may not meet the technical definition as used in the state ordinance. Maybe a space that may be a workshop, but it's not really. This is a mixed-use complex, right? We have commercial and residential spaces, and there may be a space that doesn't meet the definition of laundry, garage, or a basement, or whatever is listed there. But they will provide a few units, and there are so many unused commercial space in mixed-use residential places that it could be converted. This is the low-hanging fruit. So with a couple of words in the ordinance, you can allow this to happen. Thank you for your time.
Okay, our next speaker is going to be Ken Dunkley. After Ken Dunkley, it will be Sheila Lodge. Ken Dunkley, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Very
Yes.
good. I agree with a lot of what Alon Gallegos mentioned, and most importantly, some of the thoughts that Mayor Pro Tem Kristen Sneddon voiced about are the loosening of requirements really necessary, and are they wise, especially if you allow the larger units in the high fire areas, which are pretty much in the foothills, they're in the hills, means more cars, people can't get transportation. They're probably going to be higher priced. It's not going to be for affordable people. And I don't think you're meeting your objectives, and you're putting the rest of us at risk. That's my main concern. The density, the parking, evacuation issues. And we're hearing a lot about WUI, what is it, wildland urban interface? I think the state really needs to get a grip on that and decide, are citizens living here more important than growth and bringing in new people? Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is going to be Sheila Lodge, then Susan Baker. After Susan Baker will be Hutch Axelrod. Sheila Lodge, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Gutierrez, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, and Councilmember Jordan. Except for Vice Chair Wisdom and myself, my colleagues on the PC were concerned that simply because other kinds of development could occur in high fire zones, standard ADUs, as you've heard, ones up to 1,200 square feet should be allowed 400 square feet larger than a special ADU. It hardly seems like a good reason for allowing the larger ones. And the larger ones mean a larger household with even more cars, because cars are necessary in the high fire zones. At one time, my husband and our toddler and I lived in a 400 square foot 2-bedroom house. It was small, yet it was livable. A special ADU can be twice that size at 800 square feet. 1,200 square foot units are not necessary. In addition, they would undoubtedly cost more to rent. My concern is safety. You've heard me tell of my difficult experience evacuating during the T fire of 2008, where a panicky driver, and there were 3 of them in the line I was waiting in, could have caused an accident that blocked one of the few exit routes. 9 years later, in January 2017, the new state legislation regarding ADUs went into effect. Since then, 19% of all the ADUs in Santa Barbara have been built or are in process in the foothill high fire zones. And as you've heard, 7 of those are in the extreme high fire zone, meaning more people, more cars having to evacuate in time of fire. Local governments are at the not so tender mercy of the state legislature, governments which are supposed to provide for people's safety. Please concur with the staff recommendation to not allow standard ADUs in the high fire zones. Please don't make those zones less safe than state law requires. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Susan Baker, and then our last speaker will be Hutch Axelrod. Susan Baker, please go ahead. Susan Baker, please go ahead. Okay, we'll come back to Ms. Baker. Our next speaker will be Hutch Axelrod. Hutch Axelrod, please go ahead.
Hi, you guys hear me? Hello, council members and Mayor Pro Tem. I appreciate your guys' time. I live up in the house I was growing up in Mission Canyon, up on Ariba Way. And the real issue here isn't the ADUs. The real issue is the parking on the street. There's no rules up and down Kenmore, anywhere. Even currently, I mean, people do construction projects. There's people parking all over the place, and you can't get through. Especially a fire truck, a regular car can barely get through. The issue that I brought up before in front of the council is creating some parking limitations, is putting signs up, is red curbing, is doing this thing, allowing development of parking in front of houses, other parking spots. And the answer has been, oh, well, we have to do that citywide then because we don't want people parking in the front yards. This is ridiculous. Up here in Mission Canyon, there's plenty of space for people to be able to create parking in front of their houses, off street, because even as it is right now, somebody has a party, people park all over the place. You can barely get through. So essentially it boils down to creating parking restrictions up and down so people don't abuse that. And really that is the heart of the issue. People want to blame ADUs, but if the roadways are wide open and there are no issues, it's totally bypassable, but for fire trucks or whatever, it won't be an issue. People want to point fingers at ADUs and vilify them because they don't want, it's the NIMBY thing, and nobody, not in my backyard. You know, they don't want to develop their part of their property to be able to have off-street parking. Myself at my property, my father and myself, we've created a mass amount of off-street parking. I mean, I could probably fit 10, 20 cars off-street onto my property. And that is really the issue that needs to be addressed to be able to create safety in the Mission Canyon high fire zone, is being able to red sign, red curb, whatever it takes in the zone and looking at the streets individually and be able to create that safe corridor so people can get in and out safely. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope it'll be somehow taken seriously or looked at in the future, because we want to keep everybody safe up here, you know, and if we can create off-street parking that more than compensates for additional structures, then we'll take it a case-by-case basis. But it's really just a frightening element because there's a reckless abandon of parking and a non-enforcement of that. All right, thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Our final speaker is Susan Baker. Susan Baker, please unmute your microphone and go ahead.
This is Susan Lindsay Baker speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I live on De La Guerra Terrace, which was one of the first problem areas for an ADU. What we have now is an owner with a covenant who is not living in his original home. He's renting out the original home and he's living in his ADU. His ADU is a two-story building, whereas his original home is where he's renting. This is the High Fire Foothill District area. We have been opposed to this project since its inception. It's completed and occupied. I would to direct your attention to the Los Angeles Times, a column written by Steve Lopez, who said that all housing that is in high fire districts should be considered a criminal act because you're putting other people's lives at risk. Thank you for hearing me.
Chair Gutierrez, we have no more public comment on this item.
Thank you, Ms. Clerk. I'd like to now open it up to my colleagues to discuss, and if you feel inclined, at some point make a motion. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
So sorry with that. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want us to go through each of the 5 discussion points? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you. So, so in general, yes, I'm supportive of the staff recommendations moving forward. And then on, I'll just go through them one at a time, I guess, for the discussion points. All right, lost my place here. Okay, so for owner occupancy, I guess starting with that slide 24. For the first bullet point, that amend the existing recorded covenants, I would say yes, we can amend those that are existing, but then agreeing also with Planning Commission on the second bullet point, amend the ordinance to permanently remove the requirement. I think we should wait until the state requires us to do so. I think it's a good idea to wait and reevaluate and see what that means, especially with the potential of doubling or in some cases tripling the capacity of a unit. I think we should just, since we can wait to reevaluate that, I think it's a good idea. On the next issues, I guess in the high fire hazard area, it is astonishing to me that we don't have local jurisdiction, or that even the state isn't taking more proactive stance about limiting new development in these high fire areas. Fires burn faster and hotter than they ever have before. We're just living in a different time and era. The issue isn't the space in the high fire zones or in the extreme high fires. Plenty of space on land. It's the ingress and egress. It's the narrow roads, those winding roads, not even enough room in some cases for a fire truck to pass in one direction and people evacuating in the other. So I agree we should look at parking along those roads as well. And that's all part of our looking at our urban wildland fire plans. But I just think we have a responsibility to do the minimum of new development in these zones that the state is requiring us to do. And I think over time, the state may even rethink that potential of doubling densities in really dangerous areas. And everything in fire safety now talks about filling in the urban core and moving away from those higher fire hazard areas. And you do have to have a car unless you're sort of an extreme cyclist daily, but to live in those foothill areas, it's not just high fire, it's very steep hillside, and people will have cars. So I don't think that we should be allowing standard, those larger units, more people, more cars. It's not the density, it's not the housing, it's that evacuation route that is the really big deal there. And I think the state may update those guidelines. So really, I would go with just the minimum of what the state is requiring us to do in the high fire hazard areas and extreme high fire in both of those, which already we're allowing junior ADUs and these additional units. So it's already going to have a big impact. For the posting the sign, I think a sign posting is nice. I think it lets people know what's happening. And, you know, I think the wording could be changed to be more clear, that, you know, just as an information that this is what's happening. It gives people a chance to figure it out. I mean, I know on our block, we've had 2 of these up for a very long time, and it just caused me to ask my neighbor, like, hey, what do you have going on there? And then they can say what's going on, and there's nothing, you know, anybody's going to do about it. It's just good neighbor guidelines. And I think if you mail a letter or hand deliver or email, there's the potential of neighbors not feeling like they know what's happening. So I think it's pretty easy, a sign. I think keep the sign, but change the wording would be fine. Just an information that an accessory dwelling unit is potentially going to go there would be fine. And then on the mixed use conversion, I'm really excited about these. I think these have a potential to really sort of liven up our downtown, to bring housing into areas that are underutilized. I think they're really exciting. I think we have to take just that little bit of extra time to do it right. Ms. Dicey's recommendation that we weave that in with larger considerations in our housing element to make sure that we're not just incentivizing that everywhere or allowing that everywhere without really sort of just taking a extra moment to consider what some of those challenges might be. So I agree with the staff recommendation to consider this, continue to consider this, but then weave that in with our later amendments. I think really the biggest one for me on this is that high fire. I just can't imagine that we would go with beyond what we have to from the state, which is already doubling or potentially tripling density in some of those areas. So those would be my comments at this time.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pretty much in agreement with all of that. Let me just run through this, then I'll make some comments. So I agree with Councilmember Sneddon on amending the recorded covenants requirement, but following the state guidelines. So following that sunset date and then see what happens then. I kind of also agree with some of the assessments we heard that the state's eventually going to take care of that for us. High fired hazard areas also agree to. I think we should just get the standards out of there and live with what the state is mandating right now. I kind of share the view that the state's eventually going to take a harder look at hazards associated with fire than they are at hazards associated with the lack of housing. And they'll probably start looking at allowing additional housing in those type of zones. You know, and just to throw in a little comment on some of the chatter on that, you know, to me, it's not so much the unit, but it's who lives in the unit. And I'll just share a story of my life, and that's, you know, we have 4 kids who were somehow within 18 months of each other, if you can imagine that. And so at one time in our life at middle of high school on in college, we had 6 vehicles at our house. Now, obviously we don't have parking for 6 vehicles. And it's just one of those migrations that neighborhoods go through as you're either a couple, then you have kids, and then you're old. It kind of follows the track on how full elementary schools are, and if they're busing people in, or then 20 years later, they're bursting at the seams from everybody who's walking from the neighborhood. So to me, it's cutting down in the high fire area of what that intensity could be with a larger unit, bigger families, and the eventuality of more cars, even if initially that's not. So I would agree on just living with the state legislated mandate and removing the option of standard in those high fire hazard areas. On the sign, I'm kind of ambivalent. I think I will agree with whatever comes out of this committee, but argue my opinion in front of full council. I actually think, you know, I would argue for the sign being deleted and a mailed notice for exactly the opposite reasons that Councilmember Sneddon mentioned. You know, the mailed notice gets to people rather than somebody didn't walk by a sign. The signs eventually look horrible. They fade, you can't read them, they fall over, whatever it is. There's a certainty, and the appearance just of a sign like an icon just to me leads to too much wild speculation on what's happening there, whether anecdotal stories or on online platforms, whereas a letter can spell out exactly what's happening in writing and your options for or not having a role in that. And so I just kind of like the finality and the formality of a letter. But I think that's just an argument to make another day. And then mixed use conversions, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think by far the locations that would occur in are the locations that we're now starting to prioritize. So such as downtown or business areas or areas where services are available in walking distance and transportation is available. And just as important, it will help utilize underutilized resources that are just sitting out there going to waste in square footage, and put them to a use that is obviously more important. A couple other comments. I sat right up because I heard Councilmember Sneddon talk about just applying the state minimum, so to speak, of special across the whole city. And I'm not in favor of that being a discussion, but that's just me, but I'm happy to discuss it. I think units are units, and for us to sort of preordain the gains that can be had by units, whether it's on whoever's property it's on, is just kind of goes against what we need to do. And that's that we need to generate more units. I actually think ADUs on their face value are a much more palatable and easy way of steadily building housing stock in the city in a way that they just kind of melt into the neighborhood, whereas AUDs typically today, even though we need to work on those and have the housing, those are a bigger, more kind of shock and a slap to the surrounding properties and neighborhoods, because they're a big building with 30, 40, 50, 100 units in it, typically replacing a 1-story building with a 3 or 4-story building. And they're just a much bigger shock to the system. I can walk around my neighborhood on the Mesa and point out ADUs to somebody who doesn't live there and they don't even know they're there. Their impact is so slight, and they're softened by the fact that they're sliding into in my neighborhood, a single family neighborhood residence in a manner that is vetted by the property owner who doesn't want a problem with his neighbors, whether that property owner lives there or not. And I just think it should not be considered to reduce the scope of ADUs to just special ADUs citywide. Couple other points just that made me sit up, and they kind of are to me, whether right or wrong, characterizing attitudes as once you get by the safety considerations, but then the other underlying attitude, or whether right or wrong, that I get is that we still have a healthy I got mine and I'm not going to consider my children or Oscar's children or whoever's children coming along in the future, and where they're going to have the choice to stay in town and be adequately housed. There are plenty of examples. I'll name my daughter, a college graduate working in a tech industry, high paid job, who's sharing a house with 6 other people. Kind of like the circle of life, and that, we raised her, went away to college, lived with a group, has the opportunity to stay in town, a good paying job. But the best housing she can find for being a 6-figure income person is to live like she's a college girl again. It's just unfortunate. And I think when I hear that these will be probably more higher priced, they'll bring in new people, or love her as I do Ms. Lodge's anecdotal tales of how she and her husband lived with a child, or she and her husband lived with children in the 1940s or 1950s. These are just not germane to they're not a credible part of the conversation of what we want our housing to look like in the future, who we want it to welcome, who we want it available to. So I will continue to have that as part of my discussion on ADUs. And if I'm missing somebody's perspective that would seem to make much more sense, that happy to talk to anybody anytime about that. But I have my eyesight clearly on the next generation and the next generation after that. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. So I'll go through the points as well. So with the first one, the owner occupancy, I agree with my colleagues that we should follow the recommendation and also wait for the state to change that. When it comes to the second one, which is the high fire, I also agree that we should be way more cautious about how we develop that region in our community, because we just got to learn from the past and also from other communities and how dangerous it could be for life and property. For the fourth one, the third one, the signage. I agree that the signs should stay, although Mr. Jordan did make some pretty compelling points that are making me think now. But as of right now, I think the signs are good. I know that in my district, I have residents who pretty much make it a hobby to walk around the neighborhoods and check out the signs and actually report whether or not the homeowners are abiding to what it says on the sign. So I think having more wordage on the sign so that it's clear to people would be a benefit. But like I said, Councilmember Jordan's making me think a little more about that. So for right now, I say yes to the signs. There's just more wordage. So the last one was the mixed use. I agree with my colleagues about how this is a concept and practice that is right for our community now at this time in our history, and I will be supporting that as well. So with that being said, are we ready to have someone make a motion? Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So I'm happy to make the motion to forward the staff recommendations to City Council for the amendments for Title 28 and Title 30. And then on the additional points, it sounds like we're in agreement. So I feel comfortable going ahead and making the motions to, or we're mostly in agreement, I think, to amend existing recorded covenants on request to remove owner occupancy requirement, to not amend the ordinance to permanently remove the requirement, to restrict ADUs in the high fire and extreme high fire foothill zones to special ADUs only. I think we could, we could move to continue to notice neighbors and leave that open for discussion, whether that's a posted sign or mailing or both.
Can I make a recommendation about that posted sign? Would it be possible to add a QR code that if somebody saw the sign, they could scan that QR code and it gives a more detailed explanation of what the property owner is doing on the property? I think that might kill two birds with one stone. Just an idea I just had right now while you were saying that, sorry.
Would you want that in the motion, or to have the motion be that neighbors are noticed with potential for QR codes?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
in either the signage or the letter?
Mr. Gullett, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, Chair Gutierrez, I would suggest that staff come back with some options of what to have on the sign. I'd like to explore QR codes. It's certainly technologically possible to do that. I don't know if we're set up for that here, but I think it's a good discussion for full council.
Thank you, Mr. Gullett.
Would that
Go
be
ahead.
suitable, Chair Gutierrez, to just have the recommendation that neighbors be noticed through signage and await staff returning with QR code information?
Correct.
Okay.
That sounds good.
And then we're reserving mixed use conversion considerations. We would like to move those forward with consideration at a future date with future study. Further study.
I'll second that.
Okay. All right. Let the record show that Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon made a motion and Councilmember Jordan seconded it. Ms. Clerk, I believe we're ready for a vote.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon,
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan,
Yes.
Chair Gutierrez,
Aye.
all in favor.
So the vote is unanimous. And unless there's any other comment, Mr. Jordan? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. This will move forward to council, and I adjourn this meeting. Thank you.